Hello, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown, the podcast and YouTube channel, hosted by me, Simon. Script written today by Katie. Thank you, Katie. The format of the show, if you're new here, I've never read this before, we're going to read it together. It's all about recovered memory therapy, how we create false memories. Just to start this off with a little bit of a tangent, one of my favorite, psychological stories or whatever, and I'm certain I'm going to butcher this, is there's a group of, 30 people, and they're taking part in one of those psychological studies. And the professor's like, okay, 30 people, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a picture. And so it's like it's like a garden scene, a garden party or whatever. And people are doing different things in this photograph. And then what we're going to do, this is a very long-term study, 30 people, look at this photograph, memorize it, and we're going to seal it in an envelope and leave it in there for 10 years. And so they all do that. They all seal this envelope. They sign their name on the back or whatever so that they can be sure that the envelope hasn't been opened at any point during this 10 years. And then the envelopes, they're all tucked away. And the professor says, every year, you're all going to come back here and you're going to describe the photograph to me from the best ability of your memory. And then and they do this every year, and they come back after 10 years or whatever. And the professor says, open the envelope. And they open the envelope, and they're all convinced that it's a different photo, that the professor has somehow tricked them and swapped out the photo. And it's all to do with just the weakness of human memory. Because every year they've recalled it, and every year that they recall the photograph, they're recalling the previous time that they recalled the photograph. So all of the details they get wrong are then replaced in that memory. And as the years go by, it just gets more and more degraded and worse as they remember it again and again, to the point that they're convinced that the photo's been swapped out. I really like that. I'm sure I butchered it, but it's just like an interesting comment on the fragility of human memory, I suppose. Anyway, let's just jump into it. You're not here for my ramblings. You're here for Katie's script. Let's go.
Just before we continue with today's episode, word from one of my favorite sponsors who have a new shoe out. This is the Courtside Classic from Vessies. Vessies, you know, because I've talked about them a lot before. They've been a long-time sponsor of the show, and they make waterproof shoes, not water-resistant shoes. They are shoes that you can go stomping around in puddles in. I go walking in the woods in them, and my socks always stay completely dry. This is, as I mentioned, this is their latest, the Courtside Classic. It's got this soft tongue, keeping your feet super comfortable. Also, unlike with, Wellington boots, what do they call them in America? There's a word for it, like trench boots. Gum boots, the ones that you'd put up and they keep your feet dry normally, but those make your feet super sweaty because they're made of like rubber or whatever. These are made of a magical material called Dymatex, so despite being waterproof, your feet can breathe. It's super hot outside right now. It's like just the end of summer, although it does not feel like it, being that it's mid-30s outside. But even though they're waterproof for a summer downpour, they still let your feet breathe, which is super nice. They're kind of a retro style, a little bit of a different look from Vessies' regular shoes. I personally love it. I think it looks super cool. And why don't you get yourself a pair? And if you've had Vessies before, you know what I'm talking about. Vessies are great. Now's a little reminder. Get yourself another pair. Why not? Why not? I mean, because they cost money, Simon. But good news, you can get 15% off. Just go to vessi.com/unknown and grab yourself a pair today. You'll get an automatic there's not even a code. You just have to go to the link, vessi.com/unknown, and you get 15% off your first purchase. That's brilliant. And back to today's episode, okay?
Memory is a slippery old fish. I don't know how other people's memories work, but here's a rough overview of mine. Commercial jingles and theme songs from the 80s, 90s cartoons, they're in there for life. How do percentages and long division work? Well, that's ejected as soon as GCSE maths was over. Yeah, GCSEs, American friends, is something we take when we're 16. They're like General Certificate of Secondary Education, maybe? My parents would have called them O-levels. They're just like these exams you have to take when you're 16. I recently had to study for the US citizenship test and was getting 100% of the questions correct after a few cramming sessions. A week after the test, I could barely remember any of them. I could tell you if we ate at a restaurant in the past, but probably not what we ate. I can recall bits and pieces from the ages maybe 6 to 15, but you'd have to ask specific questions for me to be able to work out if I actually remembered anything useful. Photos and other people are of great help because seeing yourself frozen in time can definitely unlock other memories of what was going on then. I'm often in awe of sports stars who can instantly recall games dates dates and scores when I sometimes have to ask what year we're in so I can work out how old I am. Yeah, I just thought that was something that when I was young, I was like, people don't not know their age. And then I was like, the other day, I'm like, no, I'm 38. I was like, no, I'm not, I'm 37. What the? Why? Why would you add a year? I guess I have a knack for remembering embarrassing things about other people. Just ask my friend Katrina. But in all, I think my memory is probably fairly standard. We all know that the human memory is, in all actuality, pretty crap when it comes to useful things like being an eyewitness at a crime scene. People, yeah, there's even a movement, or like some people argue that eyewitness testimony should not be should not be allowed as testimony because it's just so famously unreliable, and we should just do everything on like forensics and video and stuff like that. People get things totally wrong and contradict each other all the time, and I've seen the phrase "one witness is no witness" mentioned when researching a recent case for The Casual Criminalist, which is another podcast I host. Check it out if you want to. While I'm quietly confident in my own remembering of versions of events, when there is a clash with someone else's version, it's quite a weird feeling. There's a short story by Ted Chiang called The Truth of Fact, The Truth of Feeling, in which some people use a device that is basically recording at all times, meaning that they have access to perfect memories. There's a character who chooses not to use this thing and has a strained relationship with his daughter for years because of a certain event that happened in the past. I won't go into any more detail, but as the title suggests, the story tells of the experience of being human and human memory played against technology and the ability that everyone now has to potentially be the most annoying pedant in the world. It sounds like my dream. Yeah, and with like all this ChatGPT and stuff, if we've got something like recording everything we said, you just be like, yo, did I ever talk about this? And ChatGPT be like, yes, you did. You talked about this on the 17th of August, 2024. And you're like, okay, thanks. It'd be quite useful for me. I'd be like, did I record this script already? And ChatGPT would just be like, yeah, dude, you did. Don't worry about it. And I'm like, okay, great. Thank you. At the moment, we can obviously record things, and some people do record large chunks of their lives. I guess I would be among those. But this is not the same as having your memory continually playing in the background, available for you to access at any point in time you want. Yeah, it sounds very dystopian, doesn't it? Just to have everything you're doing constantly being recorded. Even if it's like super private and stuff, I'll be like, I don't like that. If it's going up to the cloud, I'm always assuming that old, Zucks or Jeffy or Bill can have a look at it,
And then the next thing I knew, it went up. It went up to the cloud!
And you can't get it down from the cloud?
Nobody understands the cloud. It's a mystery!
I don't want Mark Zuckerberg to be able to listen. I mean, he's got no interest in listening to me having a but I just don't like the idea that he could. I was a child for the appropriate length of time, which was a good many years, but after my husband recently complained that he never got expensive gifts on his birthday, like we'd just given our daughter, I realized that I had absolutely no recollection of any birthday gifts I had ever received from my parents, apart from when I was maybe 10 and I got the Chronicles of Narnia book and a stick of green Hubba Bubba bubblegum. Really? As a birthday gift? The Chronicles of Narnia, I had that box set as well. It was, God, I can even remember the colors of it. I just unlocked a memory myself. It was in this little box set. I didn't really like it. I wasn't really into Narnia. I think my nan bought it for me. That's not to say that I've blocked out memories of horrible gifts. I just guess they weren't that amazing for me to remember. Sorry, Mum and Dad. I remember birthday gifts that my parents got me. And like Christmas gifts, like the good ones. Got a few bikes. Got a few cameras, stuff like that. Another way to forget things is to have some kind of head injury, or more likely get really, really drunk. This is when you may get flashbacks throughout the course of the next day or so of usually extremely cringe things you got up to the night before. Yes, Katie, yes! You're just sitting there feeling a bit fragile after a night out and trying to get on with your day when all of a sudden an image pops into your head of you passionately kissing your ex, who up until that point you hadn't even remembered had been there. Oh my God. For example. It's so cringe. It's so cringe. And once you start remembering these things, the highlights of all the other embarrassing and stupid stuff you've ever said come back to haunt you in a rotating carousel of shame memories. Katie, I'm glad it's not just me. Well, that's what happens to me anyway. Thank you for bringing it up. No, it's not just you, Katie. The fact that we both have this, it's everyone. I mean, I don't really drink that much anymore. So it doesn't really happen that much. I'm just like a middle-aged dude with a family. But like back in the day, you'd just be like, oh, dude, that was cringe, bro. We might wish that these things would stay firmly in the depths of our minds, but would that be mentally healthy for us? What if we were unknowingly hanging on to trauma so deeply that we do not remember the events, yet the effects seep through to damage our behavior and well-being years later? We might be going down some dark pathways of the soul here, so content warning for child abuse, although not in any graphic detail, or maybe there will be a little detail, I don't know, I haven't written it yet. Get over for coming back and fixing that, Katie. No, I'm just joking. I'd rather you didn't. I like these organic. Recovered memory therapy. What is it? There was also, I hope we get into the famous case of like the satanic panic, right? Where there was some recovered memory therapy became a thing. And all these kids started coming forward being like, no, I was abused by like a demonic cult or something. And people were like going and hunting for demonic cults. People's parents were accused of abusing their kids and stuff as part of this demonic cult. And it turns out like none of it was real. Let's let Katie tell the facts because I'm just, I just read stuff and tell stupid stories. We're probably all familiar with phrases like, I must have blocked that one out. They usually refer to things in the past that we have no immediate recollection of or have even chosen to forget, whether consciously or subconsciously. Blocked memories are also usually related to something bad that happened, and your brain, wishing to spare you the emotional pain, helpfully wiped it from your mind or put it behind some nice big walls. Or did it? Don't worry, we'll come back to this later, but for now, let's talk about recovered memory therapy. Just a note, because it's cumbersome to say psychiatrist or psychologist or even psychotherapist every time we talk about them, we'll probably just use the word therapist as a blanket term to cover those practitioners. If this is inaccurate, sorry, but you'll just have to get over it. Just heading off the comment section at the pass there, are we, Katie? Good job. When people talk to therapists, whether for a specific reason or just generally, it usually seems that the therapist wants to find out more about this person's early childhood to see if there were any core experiences there that might have shaped the issues they are having in the present. That's what it seems like on TV, anyway, but I'm pretty sure it's a valid and well-trodden line of inquiry. The idea of the repressed memory is something so awful that the person has stuffed it down deep into the recesses of their mind so that it can no longer be accessed by them in normal life. Only a trained psychiatrist or psychologist with a very particular set of skills can help them unlock this.
What I do have are a very particular set of skills.
So, if you're sitting comfortably there, let's begin.
This can then help them in their life going forward, but can also potentially go on to have another set of devastating consequences. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe you've repressed that memory for a good reason. Maybe like, let's not go digging around in your brain, digging up all the things that you decided very consciously to forget. Sigmund Freud had ideas about this way back at the end of the 19th century. He had been told of a patient who was seeking psychological treatment as she had suddenly started having a bunch of unexplainable symptoms. As a piece on healthline.com by Crystal Rapol puts it, quote, during treatment for these symptoms, she started remembering upsetting events from the past she previously had no memory of. After regaining these memories and talking about them, her symptoms began to improve. Freud believed that memory repression served as a defense mechanism against traumatic events. Symptoms that couldn't be traced to a clear cause, he concluded, stemmed from repressed memories. You can't remember what happens, but you feel it in your body anyway. Well, in that case, just give him a pill. Be like, yeah, let's not access those memories. Here's a pill. It'll make you feel better. Thank you, doctor. This might remind you of the title of a very popular book called The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. I've never heard of this book by Bessel van der Kolk. Apparently it's very popular. It's not exactly like, what's that? It's not exactly Harry Potter though, is it? Or that Eat, Pray, Love. Is that book that popular? I don't know why that's the book that popped into my mind, that talking about popular books. I mean, it's very popular, but it's not Harry Potter, is it? This was born in part out of the boom in recovered memory therapy that sprung up in the US in particular in the early to mid-1990s, although repressed memories are only part of van der Kolk's narrative. So, while the idea that repressed memories of traumatic events manifesting in strange symptoms had been around for decades, it was only fairly recently that the treatment of this issue started making waves for more reason than one. Let's start with the treatment part though. According to a list in the Healthline article, some treatments to help people recover these memories are hypnosis, age regression, brain spotting, somatic transformation therapy, and primal therapy. Primal therapy sounds like something that Liver King dude would be up to. So probably using steroids. There are a few more, but these sounded the weirdest. Brain spotting is kind of like EMDR or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. but also not, as the eyes are supposed to stay fixed on one specific location that's supposed to help trigger memories, rather than moving the eyes around as per EMDR. Oh my god, I've heard of none of these things. According to the website somatictransformation.com, somatic transformation is a body-centered, relational methodology based in interpersonal neural psychology, ancient wisdom, and the somatic emotional lived experience. That kind of sounds a bit woo-woo. Like, as soon as you say ancient wisdom, I'm always like, that sounds like you're making an excuse for not basing it in modern scientific fact. So there you go, I think we can all get a general idea of what that entails. Primal therapy is a line of thinking that in order to overcome and heal from repressed trauma, you need to re-experience it in the present and expel the psychic pain from your body, whether by shouting, screaming, or just talking about it. Using one or a combination of these or similar techniques, some therapists who practice recovered memory therapy can successfully draw out the repressed memories from their patients, and as everyone expects, these memories are usually pretty horrific. In the boom of this process that happened in the 90s, a lot of the now unrepressed memories turned out to be related to early childhood sexual abuse, or CSA, as we'll refer to it from now on. Patients were realizing that in their past, people, family members, or even their parents had abused them at least once, if not many times, over the course of several years. This is the satanic panic thing. Is this the satanic panic? Is that a different thing? This is definitely what I was talking about. Maybe I've confused it with something else, but there's definitely the repressed memories of people being abused, and then it turns out that they weren't abused, and it was just false memories. As adults, they had no memory of these events, but display symptoms pointing to the fact that they possibly had traumatic repressed memories. These symptoms could manifest as anything from being nauseated by specific foods to not being comfortable trusting your own intuition. During the 90s timeframe, it also became apparent that keeping these memories under psychic lock and key meant that many people had developed multiple personality disorders to cope with their past trauma. Also, didn't we discuss on a previous episode that multiple personality disorder is also not really a thing, at least how everyone thinks of it? These two aspects, the multiple personalities and the unlocking of the CSA, sent the recovered memory therapy business into overdrive. It seemed like if you were a therapist worth your salt, you were diving into your patient's history and digging out all sorts of hidden secrets. Clinics treating multiple personality disorder, as it was called back then, sprung up all over the place, with tens of thousands of Americans being referred through the 80s to the early 90s. It seemed like this repressed memory diagnosis was the new hot ticket in town. But it didn't evolve in a vacuum. We can trace the rise of it in the mainstream consciousness to a few popular books. One was called Sybil, the classic true story of a woman possessed by 16 personalities, by Flora Rita Schreiber, first published in 1973. The next was Michelle Remembers, the shocking true story of the ultimate evil, a child's possession by the devil. That sounds like fact, doesn't it? Which was published in 1980, and that sounds 100% like something I would have read as a kid if it crossed my radar. The third influential tome was The Courage to Heal, a guide for women survivors of child sexual abuse. That sounds like a real one. That sounds like a real book. The girl who was possessed by the devil, next to The Courage to Heal. Really? The last one was written by Ellen Bass and Laura Davis and published in 1988. This one also cites Michelle Remembers as an example of surviving CSA. Note that these are all true stories, and therapists and the general public alike took cues from the books, which all talk about repressed memories. Wait, they're all true stories? I mean, she wasn't possessed by the devil. CSA and/or what we now call dissociative identity disorder, or DID. In one respect, this is a big step forward in the world of mental health, and seemingly many more people were repressing traumatic memories than anyone had realized. With the recovered memories being freed in their sessions, people remembered horrible things happening to them and who perpetrated the abuse. Patients could now use this knowledge to confront or accuse their abusers. They could choose to cut them out of their lives or even press criminal charges. But what if these so-called repressed memories weren't actually repressed at all? What if they weren't even actual memories? What if patients had remembered things that hadn't ever happened in the first place? Well, now we get into the juicy bits. False memories. Now, before we get into this section properly, let's have a disclaimer. We're not suggesting that all therapists did what they did consciously or with ill intent. We are also, of course, not suggesting that none of these patients had ever suffered from CSA or that nobody had dissociative identity disorder. Unfortunately, these things are very real. What we're doing is taking an overview of the explosion of cases and drilling down into what might have been really going on. Here's a little taster from Ethan Waters, writing for the New York Times in a piece called The Forgotten Lessons of the Recovered Memory Movement. Quote, "The therapists writing from the period reveal their passion and zeal for the movement. This was a group of healers who believed that they had not only discovered the key to their patients' suffering, but were also exposing a hidden evil across society. The therapists, in short, were as caught up in the cultural currents as their patients. The quote ends. Now, while some people saw the huge surge in recovered memory therapy as finally solving many people's problems, others were a little bit more skeptical. It wasn't just about that particular place in time either. It was the way memories were being recovered and how the patients were expressing them that got other professionals concerned. As we mentioned earlier, the techniques for recovering these repressed memories were quite varied, and I think we should also point out that a lot of them are not considered scientifically effective, psychologically effective, or really effective at all. Things like primal therapy were huge fads for a while. Then, is that where primal scream comes from? Like the shouting and the screaming that people do or did, then kind of dropped off when other psychologists started questioning the theories behind them and found out that barely any research had been done. That's not to say people still don't use and swear by these techniques. If it works for you, fantastic. It's just that there's not much backing it up. The patient's experience was also something that registered on the skeptics' radar, as the way they recalled these apparent memories was not the same as how memory recall usually works. These recovered memories were being experienced by the patient in the moment, as though it were happening in real time in the present. Some would have strong physical reactions like fainting or vomiting, which only added to the conviction of both the patient and the therapist that these memories must be real. But were they? Were all these people really finding out that they were victims of horrendous CSA, with some also being told that they had created multiple personalities to cope with the trauma? Well, this really happened, but it turns out that the majority of the memories recovered in this therapy sessions were actually false. But how does this work? Surely you can't just make something up because it neatly solves all of the other issues that you've been having, and therapists aren't just forcing you to believe you were horribly abused for their own ends, right? Well, to be honest, some might have done this, but in most cases, this was sort of an unwitting collaborative effort on the part of both sides, although for the most part, the therapist was definitely the one in the driving seat. I think it's pretty insane that people would do this deliberately, because it's going to ruin people's lives. Like, if you're encouraging someone to make up memories that they were abused by their parents or whoever, then that can ruin those people's lives. I don't think that would be something people do. As mentioned at the time, this was really popular in America in the early 90s against a cultural backdrop of increasingly popular stories of multiple personalities, demonic possession, and satanic ritual abuse. Remember the satanic panic? There we go, that still pops up from time to time. This recovered memory therapy was gaining popularity right at the same time, so it's fair to say that many patients and therapists were already aware of these cultural touchstones before their repressed memories were eventually recovered. I knew it was related. Here's how a false memory can knowingly or unknowingly be implanted into an adult patient. The patient is seeking therapy because they're experiencing mental distress. They're going through a difficult time, or they're seeking answers as to why certain things are happening. The patient is put in a state of deep relaxation or hypnosis, where they might be more suggestible to ideas. Over the course of however many sessions, the therapist, who is excited about the idea that their patient might have repressed memories because it's the in thing, continually asks leading questions about it. Eventually, the patient starts remembering things from the past that didn't actually happen and experiences these as current events rather than normal continuous memory. Now, sure, there's something there. The therapist pushes the patient into remembering more and more detail about their abuse. The patient and therapist now believe that the patient did indeed suffer CSA. Now, if you don't think this is very realistic, I do think this is realistic. I think this is entirely possible. The brain's really amazing at making shit up. I was just listening to a podcast called Dangerous Memories from Tortoise, which covers this very topic, and the events are happening right now. A woman who is named in the series, but who we won't name here, had several patients who believed they were victims of CSA. Let's note that not every patient will go down this route and end up believing they were victims of childhood trauma, but some do, and they do so mistakenly. The victims in the podcast were all well-off young women, mostly part of the art crowd, so it was speculated that their creative imaginations also made them more susceptible to believing what their therapist was saying. It's also a window into the world of the upper class, with girls being named things like Huey and Fipsy, which makes them sound like pet guinea pigs. Yeah, I've never known anyone called Huey and Fipsy. Going back to the 1990s storyline, when we look more closely at the sort of stuff that was being revealed, especially now with the distance of a couple of decades, it seems quite obvious that the vast majority of this stuff was just utter fiction. What gave it the aura of truth was the pop culture of the time, including the books we mentioned earlier. This should not have given it the aura of truth, though, as these alleged true stories were later debunked as not remotely true at all. What? Katie, you're telling me that the girl who was possessed by the devil wasn't actually possessed by the devil? No. The book Sybil has a blurb on the website Goodreads which says, "Here is the unbelievable yet true story of Sybil Dorset, a survivor of terrible childhood abuse, who as an adult was a victim of sudden and mysterious blackouts. What happened during those blackouts has made Sybil's experience one of the most famous psychological cases in the world." Sybil supposedly had 16 personalities, meaning she had dissociative identity disorder or DID. This book was a major success, and one of the main factors in the sharp rise in people being diagnosed with DID, but all was not as it seemed. In 2011, a book called Sybil Exposed was published, and it turned out that all 3 women involved in the original book all played their part in creating the fictional tale. The real Sybil admitted she'd made up many of her personalities to gain attention and emotional support from a therapist. Yeah, that was the multiple personality disorder thing is not how it really seems. And I think that's why we now call it DID. The therapist had a specific, I don't know that for a fact, I'm just vaguely remembering something along those lines. The therapist had a specific interest in multiple personality disorder, as it was known then, so she thought she'd hit the jackpot when Sybil came along and encouraged her fictions, even regularly injecting her with sodium pentothal, a barbiturate, general anesthetic, and hypnotizing her to go deeper into her stories. That's also what they call truth serum, right? The author of the original book, Flora Rita Schreiber, also seemed to be aware that the whole case was hugely exaggerated at the very least, but she had a deadline to meet, and well, sensationalism sells. Up until the publication of Sybil in the early 1970s, there had been a minuscule number of people diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, like under 100, but suddenly the numbers shot up. According to Ethan Waters in the New York Times piece, quoting, "Over 40,000 patients, by one estimate, had come out of therapy believing they had many individual personalities, and that was only in America, and only over the period of a few years." I'm not sure how many people are generally diagnosed with DID per year these days, and the numbers vary quite widely, from what I've seen to under 1% of the global population to up to 7% possibly having the disorder. Holy shit, even 1% seems like a really high figure, but this definitely represented a sharp rise in the numbers being treated up to that point. The other influential book was Michelle Remembers, published in 1980, about a woman who as an adult used recovered memory therapy to discover she'd been a victim of satanic ritual abuse as a child, except, well, she hadn't. This was kind of unfortunate, as it was one of the cornerstones of the various satanic panic movements of the 80s and 90s, where gullible Americans thought absolutely ridiculous things were happening when there was no evidence for them whatsoever. A reviewer on Amazon called Jackie sums up what was really going on with Michelle quite nicely, including the smoking gun reveal that the author of the book, who was a therapist, actually ended up as her husband. Okay, little bit of a conflict of interest there, isn't there? Okay, quoting. "I don't know how anyone ever believed this woman or her man. From the first page, it's textbook BS. She'd grown dependent on her psychiatrist when she felt she no longer needed his services and told her. She freaked out and created this whole account out of thin air. He ran with it. They got paid, they got married, and the book was shut down because it was BS. That doesn't sound very ethical, the psychiatrist marrying the patient. Like the vulnerable patient, bro. She does give it 5 stars though, and ends the review with saying, "But it's an excellent story. Like a bad road accident, I couldn't tear myself away, Jesus." That's how she describes the book. 5 stars. Horrific. In that way that you can't look away from. I had to keep going no matter how horrible things were, no matter how full of crap I thought this couple was. I still had to read the story. So thank you, Jackie. Basically, Michelle had been going to see Lawrence Padzer for 3 years before any of this started coming out. After she suddenly regressed to speaking like a child, they spent at least another 600 hours together over the next 14 months delving into this childhood abuse. They then divorced their spouses and married each other. Michelle remembered being forced to attend satanic rituals by her mother when she was 5, held by the Church of Satan. She witnessed things like human sacrifices and was locked in a cage and assaulted multiple times. Eventually, she saw Jesus, St. Michael, and the Virgin Mary, who told her that they would block these traumatic memories until the time was right. The right time being when you were falling in love with your psychiatrist and wanted him to pay you more attention, I guess. That is not a healthy relationship, Jesus Christ. Somewhat hilariously, the founder of the Church of Satan, Anton LaVey, threatened to sue Padzer for using his church's name, as the alleged abuse was supposed to have taken place in the mid-1950s, and LaVey didn't found the Church of Satan until 1966. The name was subsequently withdrawn, but didn't seem to clue anyone into the fact that if that was clearly wrong, how much of the rest of the book could be believed. As our reviewer Jackie says though, she still read it anyway. There were also reports of another ritual lasting for over 80 days and involving hundreds of people, with deaths and self-mutilations occurring, but this was in a not particularly remote location. Unless the entire town was in on the satanic cult, nobody mentioned anything at the time. Michelle also appeared to attend school without anyone noticing the physical injuries she allegedly suffered, or that she might have missed an 80-day chunk of school. Yeah, it's made up. That's because it's all made up. Basically, the whole thing was made up. But again, it touched a nerve in society at the time, and it didn't matter much to the public if the things described in the book were more than a little hinky. It's much easier to see now how other patients were also recovering false memories of satanic ritual abuse, or SRA, as it was in popular books and on TV, and Michelle was going on Oprah years after Michelle Remembers came out, and nobody questioned her on the validity of her story at all.
You witnessed the sacrifice, right? When I was very young, I was forced to participate in that, in which I had to sacrifice an infant.
As we've already found out, this latest therapy technique was good for business. As Ethan Waters says, promoters of recovered memory therapy held regional and national conferences, states changed their statute of limitations laws to allow for criminal prosecutions based on repressed memories. The movement rode a tide of public belief that therapists helped create. The other book we mentioned was the best-selling The Courage to Heal, written by poet Ellen Bass and abuse survivor Laura Davis. Note how the title of psychologist or psychiatrist is absent from either of their resumes. The first edition of the book included examples of satanic ritual abuse coming from Michelle Remembers and other sources, all of which have been subsequently debunked, but it's that echo chamber effect of repeating the same misinformation until people start to believe that it must be true, that because they've seen it in more than one place. Yeah, what's that famous study? The one about writing down goals? It's if you write down your goals, you're 82% more likely to achieve them or whatever. And it's just been quoted so many times in so many self-help books. And some dude was like, where's that actually come from? Because everyone says a Harvard study. And it turns out that it was just basically made up.
Oh, people can come up with statistics to prove anything can't. 40% of all people know that.
And if you don't think this moment in time was particularly influential, check this out. Ethan Waters also states, quote, one survey of clinicians taken in 1994 revealed that 13% reported seeing at least one case of a patient remembering ritualistic abuse. Thousands of patients described truly incredible scenes of ritual murders, cannibalization, gang R-word, YouTube, you gotta filter yourself, and forced pregnancies. The flip side to this coin, though, is what happens to the people around the patients, the parents and relatives who they believed had abused them in the past. Well, everyone has a different story here. Some patients kept it to themselves, some cut off all ties with specific family members and would not believe that the memories they recovered were in fact false, and think about how difficult that would be. If you've come to believe that a traumatic chapter has been suppressed from your conscious mind, but you can now access it, and then you're being told that specific chapter is false, isn't that exactly what an abuser would tell you? Some people are able to come to terms with the fact that their recovered memories were not real, and others aren't. This therapy has destroyed relationships and left people adrift in their own lives. Yeah, that's pretty intense. And even if someone can objectively say no, this is false, didn't happen, and people are still dude, but I remember, I still have those memories. Because they were created by your brain and locked in that part of your brain. It's pretty f***ed up. Unfortunately, lots of people have experienced CSA, but what we're talking about only applies specifically to false memories created during recovered memory therapy. This is a minority of these CSA cases, and there's a good chance that a high percentage of them did not, in fact, happen. As a piece from the British Psychological Society called Recovered and False Memory puts it, child sexual abuse is a large societal problem, and children often do not disclose abuse unless specifically asked. The debate about recovered memories should not be used to deny these facts. What is important for the discipline is how it has used science to inform this debate. Now, earlier, we mentioned a couple of the symptoms of potential repressed memories being things like not being able to trust your own intuition and feeling nauseated by certain foods. Well, according to a book called Secret Survivors by E. Sue Bloom, there are actually many pointers that you might have been a victim of CSA, which are extremely general and seem to run the gamut from everything you can think of, from phobias, panic anxiety, to guilt, shame, and low self-esteem, to fear of being alone in the dark. So it's if there's anything wrong with you, even just a little bit, you'd be we abused as a child. It's I have a phobia of heights. Well, let me tell you where that stems from. There's also one extremely specific example, which is both hilarious and horrifying. Food sensitivity/avoidance based on texture, mayonnaise, or appearance. Hot dogs. Oh no, that is... God, no, I don't want to think that. There are so many examples of the after effects of trauma in this book that you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who can't check off at least a few boxes. Yeah, I mean, of course. Let's get back to the satanic panic aspect of this episode. One of the most famous things to come out of this era is the McMartin preschool trial, where the parents of a load of kids accused the owners of a preschool of not only sexually abusing their children, but of all kinds of bizarre stuff that the kids had apparently said. This included things like seeing witches flying around, being forced to drink rabbit's blood, and being taken to a cemetery to see corpses being dug up and mutilated. Some of these children were probably knowingly lying for fun or getting carried away with the attention the case was receiving, which was huge. Others were 100% pushed into this satanic direction by their parents and investigators, maybe unwittingly, but with leading questions and encouragement to come up with more and more lurid details. In a piece for the LA Times, Christopher Goffard writes, asked to ID his supposed abusers, one child picked two men, the city attorney and action star Chuck Norris, out of a photo lineup. Not Chuck! Is obviously ridiculous. Glenn Stevens was a prosecutor on the case, and even he knew it was all made up. In the LA Times, he says of watching videotaped interviews with the children, when you start watching about 20 or 30 of these things, you really see what's happening. They're pulling information from particular victims and asking that stuff to subsequent victims. The case just ballooned, monstrously so. Unfortunately, with Believe the Children becoming the rallying cry for the case, people were convinced that the kids were telling the truth. One child abuse prosecutor said, no amount of questioning can make a child believe what he doesn't believe. Au contraire, my friends. Eventually, after what became the longest and most expensive trial in US history, all charges were dropped against the McMartins as there were zero evidence of SRA having occurred. Ira Reiner was the district attorney who took over at the end and dismissed the charges, saying, they operated on a single principle, which was a fallacy. No child can make up such stories. Therefore, it was okay to lead them and push them. These kids believed what they said because it had been planted in their heads. There have been various studies about implanting false memories in people, usually children. Luckily, these controlled tests have been very banal, trying to see if the children would remember things as fact after a few weeks of bringing up fictitious events. They weren't trying to get the kids to believe they'd witnessed SRA. The most quoted examples are the Lost in the Mall study and the Mousetrap study. In the 1994 Mousetrap study, psychologist Stephen Ceci used a team of interviewers to speak to children aged 3 to 4 and to repeatedly ask if they had ever got their hands caught in a mousetrap and had to go to the hospital to have it removed. This had never happened to any of the children, but after several weeks of being repeatedly asked this question, over half of the children started adding their own details to the story. At the end of the study, it was revealed that this had been a fake scenario, but a quarter of the children still stuck to the story that it had happened and couldn't be convinced otherwise. A 1997 paper from Cornell University also states, furthermore, professionals who specialize in interviewing children could not distinguish between children telling false or true accounts when they were shown videotapes of the children's recollections. Probably because the children believed them to be true, right? You can now see how therapists can start tugging on a non-existent piece of thread and end up with a ball of wool. You may wonder why the children were being interviewed so many times, but the technique is similar to how someone might be interviewed multiple times by the police, say. Stories change, details get added, and if the interviewee is more impressionable, they may inadvertently be coerced into believing something happened even when it didn't. The Cornell paper says, these findings have important implications for cases involving young children, including those related to child abuse and sexual child abuse, because in some of these trials, children are interviewed many times over many weeks, months, or even years. In fact, the average child in the courtroom is interviewed formally 3.5 to 11 times before a court appearance, and many more times informally. The paper from 1997, though, so I'm not sure if procedures have changed much or not since then. I mean, but there's definitely going to be like stuff before you go to court, like asking questions and stuff. It's not like in court, just boom, there you go. And this must not be for children either. This must be across the board, which is, again, like we mentioned about eyewitness testimony not being very useful and how some people are talking about maybe it shouldn't be a thing. It's like, yeah, because it gets destroyed. It's just like a memory. This issue may be similar to false confessions, but usually in those cases, the people of interest are badgered and harangued into their false statements, and usually know in their own minds what actually happened. So now we can see how this can happen, and to carry the conclusions of those studies on, if the child or patient believes something to be real, a therapist would also, therefore, believe it happened. The Lost in the Mall study was conducted by psychology professor Elizabeth Loftus, who was one of the first people to sound the alarm during the boom in DID and recovered memory therapy diagnosis. In this study, a small group of about 25 people were given 4 events from their past and were asked to write about them. One of these stories involved someone getting lost in a mall and people having to search for them. About a quarter of the group wrote in some detail about this false event, and even when they were told one of the events was false, 5 people picked a real event instead of the false one. Studies like this show how easy it is to implant false memories or the seeds of false memories and help to instigate some pushback over the recovered memory hype. As this is decoding the unknown, we've got a little bit more investigating to do. Surely there must be some cases where recovered memory therapy actually worked and managed to unlock some real repressed memories of CSA. Right? Well, let's talk about the Jane Doe case. Now, it's obviously not her real name, although it'd be quite funny if it was. This is a case from 1997 published by psychiatrists David Corwin and Erna Olafsson. It was very influential and has been used as an example of recovered memories of traumatic childhood abuse in numerous law cases, as well as being extensively used for education and research purposes. Corwin first interviewed Jane Doe when she was 6 as part of a custody battle between her biological mother and her father. The father stated that Jane's mother had been abusing her, and Jane corroborated this during her interviews, going into detail about all the things her mother had done. Corwin came down on the side of the father, and Jane's mother lost custody and visitation rights. These interviews were all videotaped and transcribed, giving lots of information for further study. 11 years later, Corwin interviewed a now 17-year-old Jane again. Her father had died, and she had rebuilt something of a relationship with her mother, but wanted to see the videos as she was having trouble remembering what happened to her in the past. When she saw herself talking about the abuse she'd suffered, while she remembered telling Corwin about it, she didn't remember the incidents themselves. She was questioned some more and did start to recall vivid memories of being hurt in the bathroom and also of her mother taking naked pictures of Jane and her brother. At the end of this meeting, Jane decided that her mother must have abused her, as she didn't think she would have lied about it at the age of 6. Elizabeth Loftus and Melvin Geyer were extremely suspicious of these claims and ended up publishing a paper in the Skeptical Inquirer debunking the repressed memory part as having been suggested by Jane's father and stepmother when she was a child. Supposed marks from Jane's mother burning her could be put down to a simple skin condition. The naked photos information was entirely new. They also found much more evidence of a dysfunctional family life than Corwin had mentioned, which suggested that the biological mother had never likely abused Jane at all. Jane Doe sued Loftus and Geyer for defamation and invasion of privacy, but they had never exposed her real name. She did so herself when filing the lawsuit. I mean, if your name's not on there, then what are you suing for? You're just getting yourself into trouble. Out of the 21 counts of the lawsuit, 20 were dismissed, and Jane Doe settled with Loftus over the last one, as if she'd lost, then she would have had to pay nearly $500,000 in litigation fees. That was in 2007, so it would have been over $680,000 today. God damn, lawyers are expensive. Basically, with a thorough takedown of the Jane Doe case, the whole recovered memory therapy sector didn't really have a leg left to stand on. Are repressed memories even real? I know some of you have been listening to this and getting more and more annoyed and shouting out that repressed memories are real, damn you, but it turns out that this is not exactly how memory works.
It's still real to me, damn it!
Yes, we know that traumatic events can be blocked off to an extent in the mind, but they are not repressed to an extent that they are totally forgotten but still available for later specialist retrieval. We can choose not to think about things, but we know they are there. The way the so-called repressed memories were being recovered didn't make sense to some psychologists such as Elizabeth Loftus, yes again, who is an expert on memory. Here's another quote from the New York Times piece by Ethan Waters. For memory experts, like the psychology professor Elizabeth Loftus, the type of recall being described by recovered memory therapists seemed wholly new. Researchers had documented how people experiencing fear or panic will often have diminished or imperfect recall of a disturbing event. They also knew that people can be motivated not to think about a distressing memory, and that they could recall an incident from childhood and realize as an adult it was sexual abuse. But these and many other forms of memory distortions were nothing like the repression being described. Therapists across the country were suddenly certain that horrendous and repeated child abuse instantaneously could be walled away in the unconsciousness, where it would remain inaccessible for decades until unlocked in therapy and re-experienced with perfect clarity. For Dr. Loftus and others, there was simply no support in the scientific literature or in all the historical stories of human suffering that supported this type of repression and retrieval. The quote ends. The fact is, though, like we said at the beginning, memory is a slippery fish. It's not really possible to run trials on the subject of repression, as, like Crystal Rapel puts it on healthline.com, to run an objective, high-quality study, you'd need to expose participants to trauma, which is unethical. We can sometimes tell if a memory is false if there's evidence to the contrary, like contradicting facts or some sort of physical evidence, or if it's something obviously untrue, like being beamed up by aliens. The piece from the British Psychological Society elaborates on this by saying, quoting, "For methodological reasons, case studies demonstrating recovered memories of real events are more difficult to find. While a memory for space abduction can be taken as a prima facie evidence of a false memory, to show a true recovered memory, it is necessary to show that A, the event occurred, B, the person could not remember the event for a period subsequently, and C, the information recovered could not have been gained from other sources." So as we can see, it's pretty much impossible to prove a true recovered memory is exactly that. Other things that could be at play are disassociating from the event, which may block or even alter the memory until years later when you might realize what actually happened and hopefully be better equipped to deal with it. You can also use denial to such an extent that memories of certain events refuse to form completely. Rapel gives the example of, quoting again, "A child who witnesses domestic violence between their parents. They might temporarily check out mentally. As a result, they might not have a picture of what happened in their memory. Still, they get tense when watching a fight scene in a movie." There's also dissociative amnesia, which the British Psychological Society says, quote, "involves a more widespread, reversible deficit in memory retrieval that is not attributable to brain damage. It typically affects autobiographical memory for events occurring prior to a stressful event and is well recognized in the context of exposure to trauma." We know that dissociative identity disorder, or DID, is a real diagnosis in which people can experience different personalities or which do not necessarily know about the others. This is different to dissociative amnesia, however, and dissociative amnesia, while a symptom of DID, is more likely to have occurred in patients than therapists suddenly discovering a whole tranche of the population with multiple personalities. Dissociative amnesia is usually related to stress or trauma and not physical injury. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, gives the examples of car crash survivors blocking out the event, an abuse victim only remembering small bits of their ordeals, a generalized amnesia, where the person can't remember any details about themselves or their life, and systemized amnesia, which might be where a person can remember everything fine apart from a particular person or topic. Wow, that would be really weird just to forget that one specific thing. In these cases, the amnesia might resolve itself, or it might not. The general consensus is that the memories, if lost, are lost, forgotten, or never recovered. There's no walled-off, waiting to be recovered memories. The vivid, in-the-moment physical response that some patients were having with recovered memories could also be explained by the fact that they're now only coming to terms with something awful and that didn't make sense before, and they've become overcome by the horror of it. In a piece in Psychology Today, Forget Me Not, the Persistent Myth of Repressed Memories, David J. Lee writes, "Research cited by Otkar et al. Suggests that between 40 and 89% of the general population believe that traumatic memories can be suppressed and forgotten, that even an act of murder can be suppressed. Events of our past may sometimes come back to us in sudden recollection, but research finds no evidence that this happens with traumatic memories. Indeed, prospective research, following people after a traumatic event, finds that though trauma victims would like to forget their experiences, they do not. Traumas that involve brain damage may and do interfere in memory, but this is a neurological effect, not a psychological one." Eventually, the recovered memory fad died down, and some patients ended up suing their therapists. The clinics and specialized units for DID started closing down as it turned out that not so many people were suffering from it as previously thought. Repressed memories started being treated more skeptically, with LegalMatch.com now telling us, quote, "In criminal law, the use of repressed memories as evidence is generally met with skepticism and may not be admitted if the court finds them unreliable or if the process of recovering the memories involved suggestive techniques." Yeah, as it should be. They shouldn't be admissible at all. Of course, there are detractors to the detractors as well. Lots of people have come for Elizabeth Loftus, saying her research is flawed, or condemning her for going after Jane Doe, although that was more of an attack on her personally and not really anything to do with her work. I found a piece on teachtrauma.com called "Are Recovered Memories Reliable?", which notes, quote, "Dallenberg et al. Observed that researchers who challenge the reliability of recovered memories have not offered a single study in which all or most of the recovered memories were false, nor has any study in which evidence of trauma was systematically sought found an absence of corroboration in most recovered memory clients. The thing is, though, you can't really prove every memory is false. Without some sort of checking system, it's impossible. What the challengers are doing is presenting alternative suggestions for what these recovered memories might be, i.e. false memories or fabrications. We've seen in the course of this episode how people can be fed false memories or create them themselves, and while it may not have been done knowingly, it's a branch of therapy that can easily sway impressionable minds. In the end, even Sigmund Freud wavered on his definition of a repressed memory when he found out that things patients were telling him weren't necessarily true. He attributed his patient's symptoms to repressed sexual fantasies. Of course he did, Sigmund Freud! And he used the term repression interchangeably to refer to both a conscious and unconscious process. If you feel you have some unresolved memories going on, then talking to a therapist or seeing a specialist is still the best way to go. An ethical therapist will not ask you leading questions or try to push you in one direction or another. They won't jump straight to CSA, but they won't reject the idea straight away either. You'll find many therapists are still offering recovered memory therapies. Just know what you're getting into if that's the way you decide to go. Also, just a note that in the UK at least, you don't need any formal license training or qualification to call yourself a counsellor or a psychotherapist. To ensure you find someone who has training and has got the qualifications, check places like the UK Council for Psychotherapy's website at psychotherapy.org.uk for a register of alleged non-charlatans. Or you can call me, psychotherapist Katie Watson, at your service. Not really, I'm just joking. I was having trouble thinking of how to end this piece, but then remembered how we talked about Simon getting his hand caught in a mousetrap. I think that experience should be a lesson for us all. Yeah, I'm pretty sure I've never got my hands caught in a mousetrap. That would be a painful memory that I would remember. Also, whenever I'm setting a mousetrap, I'm so afraid that it's going to snap my fingers. I'm always like, I let it go. You know, you set it and then you're like, oh! Anyway, that's where we end today's episode. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate you. And I'll see you next time.